Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. I'm in a conference center in California, away from my home in Wabanaki Territory in Maine for the first time in a while, at a meeting relevant to what we're going to be talking about how to make sense of and make impact facing climate risks driven both by climate change and by community change. And I think it was in 2017 when I was at ProPublica. It was the first time I quoted Steve Strader from Villanova, who has been really pioneering with others, Walker Ashley and others, a methodology for clarifying for communities and anyone who cares to pay attention what the drivers of risk are when you're facing meteorological hazards. And actually, you've done this for non-meteorological hazards like
Yeah.
volcano risk.
Yep. Yep.
But I have you on again today to talk about this new paper in Nature's Journal, Natural Hazards. And the paper title is pretty straightforward: Changes in Tornado Risk and Societal Vulnerability Leading to Greater Tornado Impact Potential. And this is this classic formula. Risk is the hazard times exposure, how much stuff or how many people are in the way, and factoring in vulnerability or the opposite, resilience. And if you're thinking about climate change or thinking about community risk, you have to be using this formula. I have like a pocket card I should print out for everybody to with that. So I thought we could just walk through it briefly. I caught you. This is totally a pop-up version of
Yeah.
Sustain. So tell us what prompted this, and I'm going to show some of the leading community.
Yeah, of course. So a couple years ago, Dr. Victor Gensini and Dr. Harold Brooks did research and conducted a project where they looked at how tornado environments are changing. And they were just trying to see if there was any spatial changes in the ingredients that make up tornadoes. And pretty famous paper, they found that there has been an increase in the number of days that support severe weather in the Mid-South, like almost like a 500-mile diameter bullseye centered right on Memphis, Tennessee. And then there's been a decrease in environments in the Southern Plains, mainly for Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, and even parts of Houston. So naturally, everybody said this is climate change, and what's happening. We're seeing tornadoes becoming more frequent in the eastern half of the U.S. But we always had this question of how important is that? Because it's a very subtle change. It's 1 or 2 days per decade that we're seeing that are favorable for these severe weather ingredients. So what we did was we combined those results, updated it to current years, mainly through 2022, and then we combined it with census data, things like housing, population, the number of homes in what we call housing units. And then we combine it with vulnerability variables, the known factors of social vulnerability that influence disasters, like people living in poverty,
Right.
non-white populations. And what we found is when we combine those, we ended up with sort of a worse potential effects of the future here.
Right, and one of the conclusions is that even in the area like toward the Texas side of the South,
Yeah.
where there's a diminishing activity, you've got so many more people there that
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so that was not really that expected. I mean, I kind of thought it would happen, but what we really saw was, you can imagine the expanding bullseye, what we've called the expanding bullseye, or the growth in impacts due to the expansion of homes and people. Well, their best cases for that are places like Dallas, Fort Worth suburbs, or Austin, Texas. I have some friends that live in Austin, and it just continues to expand and grow.
Yeah.
Houston is quite literally one of the most sprawling cities. So what's interesting is when you look at the climatological risk in those environments, we've seen a drop in that area. So fewer days supportive of tornadoes, but it doesn't matter because we caught up and then some with our exposure changes. In other words, our population growth and our built environment, the stuff that we build, has outpaced the climate change. In this case, the climate change effects were helping us and lowering the risk of southern Texas, but our exposure growth has outpaced that. So even in areas where we saw tornadoes essentially drop in terms of their frequencies, we're seeing an increase in exposure, which means that it's a bit tricky. People think, oh, no more tornadoes here. But then you look at all the stuff as a community planner or emergency manager,
Right.
and your impacts have actually gone up despite the drop in the number of tornadoes, which is a bit of a catch-22, or at least sort of a teeter-totter effect. It's a balance.
Yeah, and then of course you add on to that the hurricane season standard meteorologist line of it only takes one.
Yeah.
So knowing that
Yeah.
any community has to be understand the hazard in the landscape.
Yeah, and we always like to say that your individual, when it comes to this exposure change, your individual risk of being hit by a tornado hasn't changed much. But if you're a city planner, if you're a policymaker, the odds that someone is hit is growing exponentially. And that's because as a community, we're tending to sprawl outward towards the suburbs, which is nothing new since post-World War II.
No, I know. And by the way, this also relates, I think I talked to you in that terrible year when the Amazon warehouse collapsed in a tornado. And I looked at the map of Amazon warehouses. If you superimpose that on this, and I asked Amazon, I never got an answer. How many of these places are you putting tornado evacuation shelters into, and that kind of thing? I'd like to know.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So here, maybe you could talk. This is the two graphics A and B, and just kind of talk through them, even if we mentioned a couple already.
So A here is taking Dr. Victor Gensini's data and essentially aggregating it to the counties. And what these numbers represent are the number of days where the environment, the ingredients of moisture and instability, the ingredients that make up severe weather, the number of days of change in those days in a decade. So blues would indicate a drop in the number of days. In this case, maybe the darkest blues of 2 to 2.5 days per decade, whereas the dark reds are an increase in the number of days. So we're talking very subtle changes here, 4 or 5 days in some of the worst case scenarios of change. But when you couple that with where we've grown in population, which is what we see in panel B, you have this juxtaposition of these two regions where we have to sort of look at that teeter-totter effect.
And that's the expanding bullseye. Essentially, there's more people and on the board where the darts are throwing, even if there's fewer darts.
Yeah, and then one thing not to get lost on panel A here is I do highlight the area where we have the 95 percentile, so the worst of the worst changes, and that's the Mid-South and the Southern Plains. Yeah. But if you took away those areas, there's a lot more red on this map than blue, which would indicate that the number of days severe weather is being experienced, at least since 1980, in the eastern half of the U.S., where we have a much larger, greater density of people, has gone up, and everywhere across the Midwest, even in the Northeast and along the Black in the Southeast.
And I noticed this includes EF1 tornadoes as well as the worst ones, the 2 through 5. Did you factor in I know there's been a shift in reporting accuracy through the decades on, because F1s are sort of on the margins where you might miss some and that kind of thing. And we have more people watching than ever because of social media and everything.
Yeah, so we circumnavigate that whole issue. And the way that we do that is we're not looking at the reports. We're not looking at where tornadoes occur. We're looking at where the environments are juxtaposed, or where we have those ingredients. So we actually avoid that whole issue. So we're actually looking truly at environments, and the panel A here would be almost like the potential for tornadoes, or in this case, where the potential has gone up.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think of it too.
Yeah.
So here's the next set of panels, and walk us through this.
Yeah, so C here is the same as panel B, but we're looking at population density. And this is more striking because you could have one fewer person in 2020 than you did in 1980, and it would show up on panel B as a brown. But when you look at the density of people, this is showing us that we're clustering more. We're having greater density in particularly areas outside of these large population centers. So these are the suburbs and the exurbs that are growing. And then D, I think, is the real message behind all this, which is if you look at the county level and you match up specifically where we have almost, if you overlaid panel, in this case, panel A and B, what do you see here in D? And that's red is where you have sort of a two-headed dragon. And blue is where you're actually doing okay. You're better than you were in 1980, but those are few and far between and really limited to the high plains. It's the everything else that's a little bit scary. In my case, I think green and red here are kind of the biggest concerns because that's where we have this mixed messaging going on.
Right.
You know, we think about the environment changing with climate change, but we have to also remember that the population is driving that and changing as well. It is not a one, it's not an if, it's not a, the better way to say this is not this or that, it's an and.
Right. And it's worth noting in this map that this goes well beyond the south.
Yeah,
Right up the
exactly.
coast.
Look at, I mean, the I-95 corridor shows up.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, again, this is really important work, and hopefully it gets to where it needs to go in terms of people making decisions about zoning or building codes. This slide's a little distorted, but basically I'm saying we're building tornado vulnerability. You know, we've talked about this many times. And I did a piece on my Substack thing a year or so ago where I was looking at the building boom. You know, manufactured homes make a lot of sense economically, right? Especially if you're on lower income. As this tweet says, promotional, fun fact Friday, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, manufactured homes account for 70% of new homes costing less than $150,000. And then there's all this promotional stuff, like there's an investment boom around these people building manufactured home, mobile home parks, and returns are very high, normally 15 to 40% cash on cash. So this is like a boom time. And then here's a classic look at one that got blown away. And I know you think about this virtually every day. So what needs to be done to get this information to people and then use it and make change in their communities?
Yeah, I mean, we found that we've uncovered that when we looked at those social vulnerability data and statistics in that same paper, we found that the Mid-South, that place that's had the greatest increase in the number of tornado days and population, has also added 12% more manufactured homes and compared to 1980. And then even in the Southern Plains, where we've had that decrease in tornado risk, but an increase in exposure, we've added almost 10% or almost 10% more manufactured homes.
Wow.
So when I sit there and think about the things that we can do, we have to realize that we have to take Benjamin Franklin's advice, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to say spending a little bit of money to make sure your home is stronger and can stand the winds. And that's doesn't have to be that expensive. It's just getting proper tie downs for manufactured homes and being aware of how vulnerable they are. Unfortunately, many people who live in these homes are strapped for cash or they don't understand and they think they're getting good quality anchoring and they're not. So there's us and some others that are really trying to work towards this. This is kind of where we're going and sort of translating from the work that we've done into how do we make people safer, particularly manufactured housing residents, which are the most likely to be killed.
Yeah. Well, the more we can do about that on here, the better. And, I would love to figure out who else. I did a session. I think you were on one with someone from the building, IBHS, whatever it's called.
Ian Giamanco and them at IBHS are doing great things. There's a lot of nonprofits out there like Fortified Home Group that is working on how to make all homes and structures safer. And then there's people on the social side like Andrew Rambach, who's working a lot on what do manufactured home communities mean for community and thinking about their vulnerability, not just to tornadoes, but to just everything. And there's a lot of really good intersection out there with people that are working on this.
Yeah, and I'm showing here, you're pressing the case wherever you can, including on social media.
I have to. I mean, it's not like I love being on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it, but I've had a fair share of interesting messages already today. But ultimately, we see this over and over again. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills where I'm just repeating the same things and seeing the same things. And yes, some of these cases, these homes are old and weren't built great, but there's a lot of newer homes that are failing and running into the same issues. It's time and time again when we get one of these strong tornadoes, it's sort of like, oh, here we are again. I wonder what's going to happen, and it's devastating because it's always children or the elderly. It's somebody's grandparents. It's somebody's kid. And that's why we think about it.
Yeah, I remember just recently in the big burst of tornadoes in May. It
Yep.
was just last month, right?
Yeah.
There was a parent, I think a child and an older person who were killed in one. You hear these stories over and over again.
Yep.
And,
It's always them. It's always the most vulnerable that struggle. And a lot of it is self-efficacy. It's the stuff that they can't do. Like a 5-year-old can't drive themselves to a shelter. Someone who's on oxygen and relies on the internet, maybe not be, or is immobile, can't make it to the shelter. So they have a lot of these issues that continue to, unfortunately, bear very ugly fruit.
Well, thanks for coming on this brief pop-up show. As soon as it's done, it'll be shareable on the various platforms. And to me, anyone anywhere on those maps, I'll just go back to the maps. Particularly the one red is where you have more population and more tornado days than you used to, and yellow is kind of a mix, and green is a mix. So if you're in those regions, this has to be something to think about. It's like with seismic risk or wildfire risk out west, the same thing. And look around your community, try to understand some of the basics of what it's like if you're in a manufactured home, what to look for. And of course, people are renting and have all these limited capacities as well. So a lot of work to be done.
Yes, I would say anybody who's in a tornado-prone region and even a hazard-prone region, which is just about every country, you have to think about these things and prepare for them. You never want to be that person that says, I wish I would have done this. You always err on the side of caution and understand the challenges that are facing you. But at the same time, you still have to take some responsibility and do what you can, or at least reach out to those that can help you. So neighbors, family, friends are very vital when it comes to safety, particularly to tornadoes. So you should reach out to someone who can either be a telephone buddy or something, but make sure that you have a way to receive the warnings and a place to get to shelter. It literally can mean life and death.
Okay, and one of the key takeaways here too is this whole idea of Tornado Alley being a place.
Yeah, it's not.
It's more a syndrome.
Yes, it is not a place. It is
right.
Tornado Alley is where we get tornadoes. There's some areas that get more than others, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's people there. So you have to be aware of the differences here. All you got to do is go back to Hurricane Ida remnants and look at some of the tornadoes we've had in the Northeast. We don't think of Tornado Alley being there, but we've had a lot of tornadoes and they typically hit things. So you have to be aware.
All right. So again, this is Stephen Strader at Villanova University, who is the lead author on a new paper, Changes in Tornado Risk and Societal Vulnerability Leading to Greater Tornado Impact Potential. And the map is wide and broad, and I hope people are paying attention. You can find him on Twitter at Stephen with a PH, M Strader. Google for his last name and tornado, and you'll find more than you ever wanted to know. I'm Andy Revkin. This is a quick pop-up episode of Sustain What, and you can get a hold of me anytime using that scrolling bar at the bottom. Thank you, Steve, again, as always.